After our father was laid to rest, my sister handed me a $300 bottle of imported vodka. She looked me dead in the eye and called it a peace offering. That night, my fiancé poured himself a single glass to honor the dead. 45 minutes later, his airway closed and he was convulsing on our kitchen floor. When I sent her a message saying I let him drink the bottle she gave me, the silence on her end, followed by a frantic panic, told me everything. Before I tell you how a funeral turned into a crime scene, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized the people sharing your blood would do absolutely anything to tear you down. The repast following my father Elias' passing was held at the sprawling Atlanta estate he had purchased decades ago. The air inside the house was thick, heavy with the oppressive Georgia heat and the rich smell of catered soul food. Macaroni and cheese, collard greens, and fried chicken sat warming in silver chafing dishes, but my stomach was completely tied in knots. I was 32 years old, standing in the house I grew up in, feeling more like an intruder than a grieving daughter. My sister Chloe stood across the massive granite kitchen island. At 35, she was the undisputed golden child of the family. She wore a custom-tailored black mourning dress that I knew for a fact had been paid for by our father just weeks before his heart gave out. Next to her stood her husband, Preston. He was a slick white corporate lawyer with a perpetually smug expression that made my skin crawl. He had his arm draped protectively around Chloe, projecting the perfect image of a supportive spouse to the room full of guests. Chloe slid a heavy frosted glass bottle of premium vodka across the smooth granite. The glass made a sharp scraping sound that cut through the low murmur of the gathered guests. "Let us stop the hostility, Jada," she said, her voice pitched perfectly, so the surrounding family members could hear how reasonable she sounded. "Dad would want us to be a united front. Take this, drink to his memory tonight." I stared at the bottle and then looked up into her perfectly manicured face. "A united front," I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register that caused Preston to stiffen. "You want to talk about a united front? Is that like when you let Dad pay your mortgage for 3 years while you told the entire congregation at First Baptist that I was a struggling outcast? You painted me as a failure just because I refused to join his real estate firm and chose to build my own career." Chloe flinched, her camera-ready smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Preston puffed out his chest, leaning forward slightly. "Now listen here, Jada." Preston started, his tone dripping with the kind of condescending authority he used in the courtroom. "Your sister is extending an olive branch on the hardest day of her life. The least you can do is show some grace." "Grace?" I scoffed, keeping my eyes locked on Chloe. "I am a senior wealth management advisor, Preston. I handle portfolios worth more than your entire law firm. I do not need grace, and I certainly do not need charity liquor from a woman who has not worked a genuine day in her life." Before Preston could respond, my mother, Shirley, materialized from the dining room. She wore an extravagant black hat, with a veil sweeping in to protect her favorite child, just as she had done my entire life. "Jada," Shirley hissed, grabbing my arm with a painful grip. "Stop ruining the repast. Your father's fraternity brothers are right in the living room paying their respects, and you are in here acting like a bitter child. Take the bottle and go sit down before you embarrass this family any further." I looked toward the living room, where several older men in their purple and gold Omega Psi-Phi ties were sharing quiet stories about my father. I loved my father despite his flaws, and I refused to disrespect his memory by causing a screaming match over a kitchen island. I snatched the heavy bottle of vodka off the granite. "Fine," I said, pulling my arm out of my mother's grip. "I will take it. But do not ever pretend we are a united front again." I turned on my heel and walked out the back door, the heavy bottle swinging in my hand. I threw it into the back seat of my car and leaned against the steering wheel, taking deep, shuddering breaths. My fiancé Terrence emerged from the back door a few minutes later. He was 34, a brilliant cybersecurity analyst with a calm, steady presence that anchored me whenever my family tried to drag me under. He saw me shaking in the driver's seat and immediately walked over, opening my door and gently pulling me into a hug. "Let me drive," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "We are done here. You survived them today, Jada. That is enough." The drive back to our townhouse in Buckhead was quiet at first. The streetlights flickered across the dashboard as I stared out the window, my blood still boiling from the interaction in the kitchen. Terrence kept one hand on the steering wheel and rested the other on my knee, offering a silent, grounding support. "I cannot stand them, Terrence!" I finally said, the words pouring out of me in a rush of exhaustion. "Chloe acts like she is the grieving widow instead of the daughter who drained his accounts. She gets a custom morning dress while I had to buy my own flight back home just to sit in a room and be treated like a stranger. My mother stood right there and called me a bitter child. I have my own home. I built my own wealth management portfolio from the ground up, while Chloe cries to them every time her credit card declines." Terrence squeezed my knee gently. "They are intimidated by you, Jada. You are the only one in that house who does not need their money to survive. Your father knew that. He might not have said it the right way, but he knew you were the strongest one. That is why Chloe feels threatened. She needs Preston and Shirley to validate her because she has nothing of her own." I let out a long sigh, leaning my head against the cool glass of the window. I just want to forget today ever happened. I want to forget that house and that entire side of my family. When we finally pulled into our garage, the silence of our own home felt like a sanctuary. Terrence grabbed his suit jacket and reached into the back seat, pulling out the frosted bottle of vodka Chloe had given me. He held it up, examining the expensive label. "Well," he said, trying to lighten the mood, "at least your sister has expensive taste in peace offerings. We should have a drink, a toast to your dad, just the two of us making our own united front." I looked at the bottle and felt a wave of nausea. "I do not want anything from her, Terrence. Pour it down the sink for all I care. I need a shower. I need to wash the smell of that house off my skin." "Go take your shower," he said, kissing my forehead. "I will order some food. We can just relax tonight. No more family drama." I left him in the kitchen admiring the bottle and walked upstairs to our master bathroom. I stripped off my dark dress, feeling the heavy weight of the day pressing down on my shoulders. I turned the shower on as hot as it would go, letting the steam fill the room. Stepping under the scalding water, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to finally cry for my father. Away from the judging eyes of Shirley and Chloe, I could just be a daughter missing her dad. The hot water drummed against the tiles, drowning out the world outside. I stood there for what felt like hours, letting the tension melt out of my muscles. I turned off the water and wrapped a thick towel around my body, drying my hair. The bathroom was completely silent, except for the hum of the ventilation fan. I opened the door to step into the bedroom, and that is when I heard it. A sharp, violently loud crash echoed from the kitchen downstairs. It sounded like heavy glass shattering against the hardwood floor. I froze for a second, my heart kicking against my ribs. "Terrence," I called out, walking toward the top of the stairs. "Did you drop something?" There was no answer. "Terrence," I called louder, my voice pitching up with sudden anxiety. The silence that followed was entirely wrong. It was a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by a strange, rhythmic thumping sound. It sounded like a heavy shoe kicking repeatedly against the baseboards. I abandoned my hair towel and ran down the stairs, taking them two at a time. I turned the corner into the kitchen, and the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. Terrence was on the floor. His tall, muscular frame was contorted violently, his back arched in an unnatural, rigid bow. His eyes were rolled back in his head, and his mouth was open, gasping for air that he could not seem to pull into his lungs. The rhythmic thumping was his heels striking the cabinet door as his body seized uncontrollably. "Terrence," I screamed, dropping to my knees beside him on the wet hardwood. He could not answer. His skin was incredibly clammy, slick with a cold sweat, and his lips were already taking on a terrifying shade of blue. He was choking, his hands clutching weakly at his own throat. I grabbed his shoulders, trying to roll him onto his side so he would not choke on his own saliva. His muscles were locked tight, rigid like stone. Panic exploded in my chest, blinding and absolute. I scrambled backward, my wet hands slipping on the floor, grabbing my phone off the kitchen counter. I dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly I almost dropped the device. 911, what is your emergency?" the operator asked. "My fiancé is having a seizure." I screamed, the phone pressed hard against my ear. "His airway is closing. He cannot breathe. You need to send an ambulance right now. We are at 428 Peachtree Lane. Please hurry." The operator's voice was calm, guiding me through the chaos. "Is he breathing at all, ma'am? Roll him onto his side. Clear the area around him. I dropped the phone on speaker and wrestled Terrence onto his side. He let out a horrible, ragged gasp, a sound like a drowning man fighting for a single breath of air. High as choking, I cried out, holding his head steady. What do I do? Start chest compressions. If he stops breathing completely, the operator instructed. The paramedics are en route. They are 3 minutes away. Stay on the line with me. I positioned my hands over his chest, pushing down hard, praying with every ounce of my soul. Come on, Terrence, breathe, please breathe. The next 3 minutes stretched into an eternity of pure agony. The sound of sirens finally pierced the night, wailing down our quiet street. Tires screeched in the driveway and heavy boots pounded up the front steps. I screamed that the door was unlocked. 3 paramedics rushed into the kitchen, carrying heavy medical bags and a portable oxygen tank. They pushed me back, taking over immediately. One paramedic tilted Terrence's head back, forcing an oxygen mask over his blue lips, while another ripped open his shirt to attach heart monitor pads. What happened? The lead paramedic demanded, shining a bright penlight into Terrence's unresponsive eyes. Does he have a history of seizures? Does he have any medical conditions? Did he take any drugs? No, I sobbed, clutching my towel around me, shivering violently from the cold air and the shock. He is perfectly healthy. He was just down here waiting for me to take a shower. He just had a glass of— My voice died in my throat. I looked past the paramedics to the spot where Terrence had been standing. Shards of broken glass were scattered across the floor, pooling in a clear puddle of liquid. Sitting perfectly intact on the counter directly above the mess was the heavy frosted bottle of imported vodka. The cap was unscrewed. The peace offering my sister had pushed across the granite island just hours ago. He poured himself a drink, I whispered, staring at the bottle in absolute horror. He drank the vodka. The paramedic looked at the bottle, then back at Terrence, who was still violently seizing. We need to push him with a sedative and get him intubated immediately, or he is going to suffer brain damage, the medic shouted to his partner. Let us load him up. We are moving. They hoisted Terrence onto a stretcher, moving with terrifying speed. I scrambled to grab clothes, throwing on sweatpants and a sweatshirt over my damp skin, grabbing my keys and my wallet. We are going to Emory University Hospital, the paramedic yelled back at me as they rolled the stretcher out the front door. Do not follow the ambulance too closely. I stood in the doorway, watching the red and blue emergency lights paint the houses on my street in violent flashes of color. The ambulance doors slammed shut, tearing off into the night with the man I loved fighting for his life inside it. I turned back to the kitchen, staring at the counter. The frosted bottle sat there under the bright pendant lights, mocking me. I thought about Chloe sliding it across the island. I thought about Shirley forcing me to take it. I thought about Preston's smug smile. I grabbed a plastic grocery bag and carefully placed the bottle inside, making sure not to touch the glass too much. I did not know exactly what was happening yet, but my instincts as a woman who had survived that family my entire life were screaming at me. They did not give me a peace offering. They gave me a death sentence, and Terrence took the bullet meant for me. The sterile sliding doors of the emergency room at Emory University Hospital swallowed Terrence whole. I stood frozen in the waiting area, clutching the plastic grocery bag containing that frosted glass bottle. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the linoleum floor. Every second dragged like concrete. A nurse with tired eyes rushed past me, shouting orders to a trauma team. I could see glimpses of Terrence through the small glass window of the swinging doors. A team of doctors surrounded him. One was yelling for a crash cart. Another was forcing a plastic tube down his throat. They were intubating the man I loved because his body was systematically shutting down. A young resident finally pushed through the double doors and walked toward me. His scrubs were wrinkled and his face was grim. He asked me again what Terrence had consumed. I handed over the plastic bag with the vodka bottle. I told him Terrence had one glass, just one, and within 45 minutes, he was seizing on our kitchen floor. The resident took the bag with gloved hands, stating they needed to run an immediate heavy metals and broad-spectrum toxicology screen. He told me Terrence was in critical condition. His airway had collapsed completely, and they had placed him in a medically induced coma to stop the violent muscle spasms that were tearing his body apart. I sank into a rigid plastic waiting room chair. My hands were covered in a thin layer of dried sweat and Terrence's saliva from when I tried to keep him from choking on his own tongue. My dark dress from the repast was clinging to my damp skin. Just a few hours ago, I was standing in my father's house listening to my mother surely demand that I play nice. I closed my eyes and pictured Chloe sliding that bottle across the granite island. I remembered the exact pitch of her voice, that fake Southern belle sweetness she perfected to mask her venom. She called it a peace offering. The shock began to evaporate, replaced by a slow, creeping, icy rage. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. My mind, trained to analyze risks and dismantle hostile financial takeovers, snapped into absolute clarity. I opened my text thread with Chloe. Her last message to me was from 2 weeks ago, demanding I pay for the caterer for our father's funeral because she and Preston were temporarily low on liquid assets. I ignored the old message and typed a new one. My thumbs hit the screen with deliberate heavy strikes. Terrence is in the emergency room. He drank the vodka you gave me. I hit send. I watched the tiny word delivered appear under the text bubble. I expected her to ignore it. I expected her to wait until morning and pretend she was asleep. I expected a dismissive text telling me not to be dramatic and blaming Terrence for having a weak tolerance. I did not expect my phone to ring less than 10 seconds later. Chloe's face flashed on my screen. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear, but I did not say a word. I just listened to the dead air on the other side. The sound coming through the speaker was not my polished, perfectly put-together older sister. It was not the woman who coordinated charity galas and wore custom mourning dresses. It was the sound of a woman completely unraveling. Chloe was hyperventilating. I could hear her gasping for air, her breaths coming in short, panicked wheezes. The background was deadly quiet, meaning she had likely locked herself in a bathroom away from her husband Preston. Jada, Chloe gasped, her voice shrill and trembling. Jada, are you there? Tell me you are there. I am here, I said, my voice dropping to a flat, dead calm. How much did he drink? She demanded, the words tripping over each other. How much of the bottle on? Jada, listen to me. Did you drink any of it? Tell me you did not drink it. I sat perfectly still under those buzzing hospital lights. I processed her words, turning them over in my mind. She did not ask which hospital we were at. She did not ask what the doctors were saying. She did not ask if Terrence was breathing, or if he was conscious, or if he was going to survive the night. She only cared about one single detail. She needed to know if I had ingested the liquid inside that bottle. Why does it matter if I drank it, Chloe? I asked, tightening my grip on the phone. My fiancé is on a ventilator. You were not supposed to share it, Chloe screamed into the phone, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered terror. It was just for you. You were not supposed to give it to him. Before I could demand to know what she put in that glass, the line went dead. The call dropped, plunging me back into the sterile silence of the emergency room waiting area. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the dark screen. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place with sickening clarity. My sister did not give me a peace offering. She gave me poison, and she was panicking because she missed her target. I did not waste another second in that sterile waiting room. I left Terrence in the hands of the trauma team, walked out the sliding glass doors, and got back into my car. The engine roared to life, matching the furious pounding in my chest. I merged onto the highway, pressing the accelerator to the floor. Buckhead was normally a 20-minute drive, but at 3 in the morning, the streets of Atlanta were completely empty. The city blurred past my windows as my mind operated like a hyperactive ledger, calculating the exact depth of my sister's betrayal. Every mile marker was a reminder of how deep this resentment ran. Chloe had spent her entire life taking what she wanted, shielded by our mother's endless excuses. When Chloe failed out of her first semester of college, our mother bought her a car to soothe her anxiety. When I graduated at the top of my class with a finance degree, I received a simple pat on the back and a bill for my own graduation dinner. They had always treated me like an obstacle, an inconvenience that refused to fail. But poisoning my fiancé was an escalation I had never anticipated. They had crossed a line from toxic family dynamics into literal criminality. I pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of Chloe and Preston's sprawling estate. They changed their security code every 6 months to keep out the people they deemed beneath them. But I was the wealth management advisor who structured the hidden accounts they used to qualify for this massive mortgage. I knew the master override code I had quietly set up for them 3 years ago. I punched the numbers into the glowing keypad. The heavy iron gate swung open without a sound. I did not bother parking in the circular driveway. I drove straight over the curb, my tires tearing deep, muddy trenches through their perfectly manicured front lawn. I slammed the car into park, marched up the stone steps to the massive mahogany front door, and began pounding with both fists. I hit the solid wood so hard my knuckles instantly bruised. I did not stop. I hammered against the door until the security light snapped on, casting a blinding glow over the porch. The deadbolt clicked, and the heavy door yanked open. Preston stood there hastily cinching the belt of a navy blue silk robe. His angular white face was flushed with anger, his pristine corporate lawyer mask slipping at the sight of me standing on his porch like a vengeful spirit. He immediately tried to slam the door shut, but I wedged my heavy leather boot firmly inside the frame. "Jada, it is 3 in the morning. Are you out of your mind?" Preston hissed, his voice a harsh whisper designed to keep the wealthy neighbors from waking up. "Remove your foot from my door right now." "Where is my sister?" I demanded, pressing my shoulder heavily against the wood. Preston pushed back, his face twisting into a sneer of pure condescension. He held up his hands, adopting that fake calming tone men use when they want to make you look hysterical. "Jada, listen to yourself. Your father just died. You are overwhelmed with grief. The stress is making you paranoid and erratic. Go home, get some sleep, and we can discuss whatever misunderstanding this is tomorrow. Step off my property before I call the Atlanta Police Department and have them haul you away in handcuffs. Do you really want to risk your financial licenses over a psychiatric hold?" I was trying to use his status, his privilege, and his corporate weight to intimidate me, just like he did to everyone else in my family. But I was not my mother, and I was not intimidated by a man whose credit card debts I used to secretly monitor. "Call them, Preston," I said, leaning closer so he could see the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. "Call the police right now. Tell them my fiancé is currently intubated at Emory University Hospital because of a gift your wife handed me at our father's repast. Let us get the detectives over here immediately to discuss attempted murder." The blood drained completely from Preston's face. His grip on the door handle loosened just enough. I slammed my shoulder forward with all my weight, forcing the heavy mahogany door open and throwing Preston off balance. He stumbled backward into the grand marble foyer, shouting objections about assault and trespassing, but I was already walking past him. I marched straight toward the sweeping double staircase. Chloe was standing halfway down the carpeted steps, gripping the polished wooden banister. She was not wearing sleepwear. She was fully dressed in designer loungewear, her makeup still perfectly applied. She had been awake this whole time, pacing, waiting, panicking. I took the stairs 2 at a time. Preston was yelling behind me from the foyer, threatening to press charges, but he did not dare physically grab me. I reached the landing and grabbed the collar of Chloe's expensive cashmere sweater, pulling her face mere inches from mine. She reeked of nervous sweat masked by stale designer perfume. "What did you put in the bottle?" I demanded. My voice was deadly quiet, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of their ridiculous mansion. Chloe tried to twist away her eyes, darting over my shoulder to Preston for rescue. She instantly played the victim, her voice trembling. "I do not know what you are talking about. Let go of me. You are crazy, Jada. You need help." I tightened my grip, twisting the expensive cashmere fabric until she gasped for air. Her carefully constructed persona was crumbling right in front of me. The confident, wealthy socialite who looked down on everyone was gone. In her place was a desperate, cowardly woman who realized her sloppy plan had gone horribly wrong. "Terrence is choking on a ventilator right now because of the peace offering you shoved in my face," I said, refusing to let her look away. "You called me 10 minutes ago. You did not ask which hospital we were at. You did not ask if he was alive. You only asked if I drank it. What was in the vodka, Chloe?" She trembled violently under my grip. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen in her before. She had always believed she was untouchable, because our mother always cleaned up her messes. But surely could not clean up an attempted murder charge. She looked helplessly down at Preston, who had stopped yelling and was now staring at his wife with a look of dawning horror, realizing that his golden goose might have just committed a major felony. Before Chloe could formulate another lie to spin her way out of this, the sharp, sudden ringtone of my phone shattered the heavy tension on the staircase. I let go of her sweater and pulled the phone from my pocket. The caller ID flashed the number for the Emory Hospital emergency room. I answered it immediately, pressing the speaker button and holding the phone up so the entire grand hallway could hear the truth. I accepted the call and pressed the speaker button. The voice of the emergency room physician echoed through the massive vaulted foyer of Preston and Chloe's mansion. Everyone froze. The doctor sounded exhausted, but his words were sharp and clinical. He told me they had the preliminary toxicology results back from the lab. He asked if I was in a safe place to receive the information. I kept my eyes locked on my sister and told him to speak. The doctor stated that Terrence had ingested a massive dose of a highly specialized muscle relaxant. It was a synthetic compound not typically found in recreational drugs or standard prescriptions. The doctor explained that the drug rapidly paralyzes the respiratory system before plunging the victim into a profound state of deep, unrousable sedation. He told me that based on the concentration found in Terrence's blood, the dosage was explicitly designed to incapacitate an adult human for a minimum of 48 hours. The doctor added that because Terrence is a heavy-set athletic man, his body fought the rapid sedation, causing the violent seizures. If a smaller person had taken that exact dose, they would have simply slipped into a coma and stopped breathing entirely. If I had poured that glass for myself, I would be dead, or currently lying on a ventilator with no brain activity. The call ended with the doctor assuring me Terrence was stabilized, but would remain sedated. The silence that followed in the grand hallway was suffocating. Chloe completely collapsed under my grip. Her knees buckled and she slumped down onto the carpeted stairs, sobbing hysterically. She kept repeating that she did not mean to hurt Terrence and that it was supposed to be a mild sedative, just enough to make me sleep through the weekend. Preston finally snapped out of his shocked stupor. He rushed forward and grabbed his wife by the shoulders, violently pulling her away from me. He hissed at her to shut her mouth and demanded she stop speaking immediately. As a corporate defense attorney, Preston knew exactly what a confession sounded like, and his wife was loudly giving one. He glared at me, adjusting his silk robe and trying to regain his composure. He told me the doctor was clearly mistaken, and that Chloe simply gave me an old bottle of liquor that must have gone bad. He said I had no proof of any tampering, and that any competent judge would throw out a wild accusation of poisoning. I ignored Preston entirely. My mind was racing, analyzing the specific timeline the doctor mentioned, 48 hours. They needed me unconscious and unreachable for exactly 48 hours. Why that specific window of time? What was happening between now and Monday morning? I looked down at Chloe, who was burying her face in her hands, crying about her ruined reputation. Then I looked at Preston. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely focused on damage control. I was already planning his legal defense. This was not a crime of passion or sibling jealousy. This was a premeditated corporate strike. Preston always hated that my father, a self-made black man from the South Side, refused to let a slick white lawyer from a legacy firm dictate his business moves. Elias kept Preston out of the boardroom and treated him like a glorified paper pusher. Preston saw my father's death as the perfect opportunity to finally seize the assets he felt entitled to, and he used my greedy sister to do his dirty work. I pulled my phone back up and opened my calendar app. I scrolled past the funeral arrangements and the repassed details, looking at the schedule for today. A harsh laugh escaped my throat, cutting through the sound of Chloe crying. I stared at the bold red text taking up the 9 o'clock time slot. My father, Elias, built a massive commercial real estate portfolio across Atlanta. He owned shopping plazas, office buildings, and lucrative historic properties. Before he passed, he divided his voting shares between Chloe and me. However, the company bylaws stated that in the event of the founder's death, an emergency shareholder vote must be held within 72 hours to select the interim executor of the entire portfolio. The executor gains complete unilateral control over the board, the bank accounts, and the upcoming property sales. The bylaws also contained a very specific attendance clause. If a voting shareholder fails to appear at the emergency meeting and fails to provide a legal proxy, their shares are temporarily suspended for that vote. I looked back up at Preston and my sister. The puzzle was completely solved. If I had taken a drink of that vodka, I would be lying unconscious in a hospital bed or dead in my own home. I would miss the emergency meeting. Chloe would be the only voting shareholder present. She would win the executor seat by default, handing total control of our father's multi-million-dollar empire over to her and her husband. They did not just want to sideline me. They wanted to steal my inheritance and lock me out of the company my father built with his own two hands. I checked the time at the top of my phone screen. It was currently 4:15 in the morning. The emergency shareholder meeting was scheduled to begin in exactly 4 hours and 45 minutes at the corporate headquarters downtown. Preston noticed me looking at my calendar, and his jaw tightened. He knew that I knew. He pointed a finger at me, warning me that if I went to the police with this absurd story, he would sue me for defamation and ruin my wealth management career. I stepped back from the staircase, smoothing down my wrinkled clothes. I looked at the two of them cowering in their luxurious mansion built on lies and manipulation. I told Preston I was not going to the police station right now. I told him I had a board meeting to attend. I turned my back on them without another word. I did not run. I walked down their sprawling marble steps with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had just been handed the keys to their destruction. I got into my car, threw it into reverse, and tore out of their driveway, leaving deep, ugly tire tracks across their perfectly manicured front lawn. As I sped back toward the hospital, the dark, empty streets of Buckhead gave way to the glowing skyline of downtown Atlanta. The cold morning air rushing through my cracked window matched the absolute ice running through my veins. The pieces of their pathetic, cowardly conspiracy were clicking together so loudly in my mind it was deafening. Preston was a senior partner at a legacy law firm that catered to old money and corporate acquisitions. My father, Elias, built his commercial real estate empire from the ground up, starting with a single small barber shop in the West End and turning it into a multi-million-dollar portfolio that stretched across the entire city. My father was a proud black man who never trusted Preston. He kept Preston's law firm on a very tight leash, using them for basic compliance paperwork, but completely locking them out of the high-level acquisitions and property management deals. My father knew Preston was a vulture, simply waiting for a carcass to pick clean. With my father gone, Preston saw his opening. The emergency shareholder meeting was the gateway. If Chloe became the interim executor, she would have unilateral authority to restructure the company from the inside out. She would immediately award the exclusive management contracts and massive legal retainer fees to Preston's firm, funneling millions of dollars of my father's legacy directly into her husband's pockets. But my voting shares were the roadblock. They knew I would vote against Chloe because I knew she was financially incompetent. They needed a deadlock breaker. They needed me completely neutralized, unable to show up, unable to cast a vote, and unable to sign a proxy. A 48-hour medically induced coma courtesy of a poisoned peace offering was their brutal, calculated solution. They did not care if I died or suffered permanent organ damage. They only cared that my chair in the boardroom remained empty at 9 o'clock this morning. I pulled back into the parking deck at Emory University Hospital just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Atlanta sky in bruised shades of purple and red. I bypassed the waiting room and walked straight back into the intensive care unit. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I stepped into Terrence's room. I was lying there, his massive, strong chest rising and falling in slow mechanical rhythms dictated by the ventilator tube taped to his mouth. The violent seizures that had ripped through his muscles just hours ago had stopped, replaced by a terrifying drug-induced stillness. I walked over to the side of his hospital bed and gently took his large, warm hand in mine. This man, brilliant, kind, and fiercely protective, was lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life, simply because he tried to shield me from the ugliness of my own blood. He had poured that drink to honor a man who never fully appreciated him, and in doing so, he took the hit that was explicitly designed to take me out. I traced the knuckles of his hand, my thumb brushing over the glowing pulse monitor taped to his finger. I did not cry. I had shed my last tear for my family when I was a teenager, begging for my mother's basic approval. Right now I only had room in my heart for absolute calculated ruin. I leaned down, pressing my lips against Terrence's forehead. I whispered a promise against his warm skin. I told him to rest and let the medicine do its work. I promised him that while he was sleeping I was going to war. I vowed that I would tear my family's empire down to the studs. I promised that by the time he opened his eyes and the breathing tube was removed, the people who put him in this bed would have absolutely nothing left to their names. Not a single dollar, not a corporate title, and not a shred of dignity. I checked the digital clock glowing on the hospital wall. It was 8:15 in the morning. The shareholder meeting was set to begin in exactly 45 minutes. I walked over to the small mirror hanging above the sink in the hospital room and looked at my reflection. I looked like a waking nightmare. I was wearing oversized gray sweatpants and a dark hoodie I had hastily thrown on over my damp skin when the paramedics arrived. My natural hair was wild and completely uncombed. There was a dark smear of dried blood on the cuff of my sleeve from where I had braced Terrence's head against the hardwood floor to keep him from fracturing his skull during the seizure. I looked exactly like a woman who had just survived a tragedy. Any other day, for any other business meeting, I would have driven home to shower. I would have put on a tailored designer suit, immaculate makeup, and armored myself in the polished professional image I used to command respect as a wealth management advisor. Not today. Today they needed to see the blood. They needed to look at my face and see the brutal reality of what they had done. I turned away from the mirror and walked out of the hospital without looking back. I got into my car and drove straight to the corporate headquarters downtown. I pulled up to the towering glass high-rise at exactly 8:50 in the morning. I did not pull into the parking garage, and I did not stop for the valet. I parked my car directly in the red fire lane right in front of the main entrance. I threw my keys at a startled security guard who tried to tell me I could not leave my vehicle there. I ignored him and marched straight through the revolving glass doors, ready to burn their perfectly planned morning to ash. The heavy oak double doors of the executive boardroom were closed tight. I did not bother knocking. I raised my boot and kicked the brass handles hard enough to send both doors slamming violently against the interior walls. The sound cracked through the quiet room like a gunshot. I walked in at exactly 8:59 in the morning. The boardroom was a shrine to my father and the empire he had built. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling downtown Atlanta streets. Sitting right in his custom leather chair at the head of the massive mahogany table was my sister Chloe. She was wearing a pristine ivory blazer, looking like she had just stepped off a magazine cover. Preston stood right behind her, with his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. Two crystal flutes and a bottle of expensive champagne were already sitting on a side cart. They were literally preparing to toast to my absence. Around the table sat the 6 senior board members. These were distinguished men and women who had known my father since he was running his very first property out of a small storefront in the West End. They stared at me in absolute shock. I knew exactly how I looked. My natural hair was wild and uncombed. My oversized gray sweatpants were stained with Terrence's saliva, and sweat and the dark smear of dried blood on my sleeve was impossible to ignore. I looked like a woman who had just crawled out of a war zone. Preston recovered first. He immediately shifted into his slick corporate defense attorney persona. He stepped away from Chloe, raising his hands in a patronizing, placating gesture, while subtly pressing the intercom button on the table. "Security, we need assistance in the main boardroom," Preston said into the speaker, his voice oozing with manufactured concern. He then turned to the board members, shaking his head sadly. "I apologize for this interruption, everyone. As you know, Elias' passing has hit Jada incredibly hard. She has been erratic all week. Jada, please, you are having a mental breakdown. Let me escort you to a hospital before you embarrass yourself further." I did not stop walking. I marched straight down the length of the table. "Cancel security." I snapped at the trembling assistant standing near the door. My voice carried the lethal, authoritative weight I used to command rooms full of hostile investors. I stopped directly across from Preston and Chloe. Chloe looked like she was going to vomit. The arrogant smirk she had worn a moment ago had completely melted off her face. Her eyes darted from my face to my blood-stained sleeve, and I saw her chest begin to heave with panicked, shallow breaths. "Mental breakdown, Preston," I said, staring him down. "Is that the cheap legal strategy you use when you cannot bully your way into a contract? My father kept your hands off his portfolio for 15 years because he knew you were a parasite. He knew you married my sister because she was a weak link you could easily manipulate to get a seat at this table." Preston flushed a deep, angry red. He pointed a finger at me, stepping forward to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You are trespassing on a closed corporate meeting, Jada. You are not in any psychological state to cast a vote today." I reached into my hoodie pocket and pulled out the folded emergency room toxicology report. I slammed it down onto the center of the mahogany table right in front of Mr. Henderson, my father's oldest and most trusted business partner. "I am not here for grief counseling," I announced clearly, making sure every single board member heard me. "I am here to cast my vote, and I am here to present evidence of attempted murder." The entire room erupted into frantic whispers. Mr. Henderson picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the clinical red text from Emory University Hospital. Preston lunged forward, trying to snatch the paper out of Henderson's hands, but the older black man pulled it away, glaring at Preston with absolute disdain. "That is fake!" Chloe stammered, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. She gripped the edges of her leather chair, her knuckles turning white. "She is lying. She has always been jealous of me. She is making this up to ruin my appointment as executor." I leaned across the table, putting my face just inches from my sister's perfectly contoured face. "My fiancé is currently on a ventilator in the intensive care unit," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that silenced the room. "The doctors just pulled a lethal dose of synthetic muscle relaxant out of his bloodstream, the exact same muscle relaxant that was inside the $300 peace offering you shoved into my hands last night." Preston tried to interrupt, his voice rising in panic as he realized the board members were looking at him with deep suspicion. "This is defamatory garbage. You have no proof of anything. You are a bitter woman trying to disrupt a legal corporate proceeding because you know Chloe has the votes to take control of this company." I stood up straight, adjusting my blood-stained hoodie like it was a tailored blazer. "I am wide awake, Preston," I announced, "unlike your wife's cowardly attempt to sedate me into forfeiting my shares." The board members gasped in unison. Mr. Henderson dropped the report onto the table, his face a mask of pure shock and fury. Chloe buried her face in her hands, sobbing audibly, as her pristine image shattered in front of the most important people in our father's life. I had them backed completely into a corner. I was ready to call for an immediate vote to expel Chloe from the company entirely and hand over the investigation to the police. But before I could demand the motion, a voice cut through the chaos from the dark shadows at the back of the boardroom. It was a voice that stopped my heart and made my blood run instantly cold. "That is quite enough theatrics for one morning, Jada." The voice sliced through the heavy air of the boardroom. I turned toward the shadows near the privacy doors. My mother Shirley stepped into the morning light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was wearing a flawless navy blue knit suit, her signature pearls resting against her collarbone. Not a single hair was out of place. She looked at my wild, uncombed hair and the dried blood on my gray sweatpants with absolute cold detachment. There was no maternal shock. There was no gasp of horror at the news of Terrence fighting for his life in an intensive care unit. She just looked mildly inconvenienced by my presence. I stared at her, feeling the floor tilt beneath my feet. "Mom," I said, my voice cracking for the very first time today. "Chloe poisoned Terrence. He is on a machine breathing for him." Shirley walked slowly toward the massive mahogany table. She did not even glance at her sobbing eldest daughter or the toxicology report resting near Mr. Henderson. "You have always been so dramatic," Jada Shirley said, waving her hand as if swatting away a fly. "It does not matter if you are awake. You are always making a spectacle to draw attention away from your sister's accomplishments. It is the exact same stunt you pulled at Chloe's rehearsal dinner when you loudly refused to cover the catering bill just because you wanted everyone to know you were a big-shot wealth manager making your own money. You are obsessed with being the victim and dragging this family name through the mud." I felt a physical blow hit my chest, forcing the air from my lungs. My fiancé was poisoned by a bottle she literally forced me to take last night, and she was bringing up a catering bill from 4 years ago. Shirley reached into her pristine leather tote bag. She pulled out a thick document bound in a heavy blue legal folder. She slammed it down on the table right next to my hospital report. "Your father knew how unstable you were," Shirley said, looking me dead in the eye with a gaze devoid of any human warmth. "He knew you would try to tear this family apart out of pure jealousy. That is why your father gave me power of attorney the week before he passed. I hold the legal right to act on behalf of his estate and any incapacitated or absent shareholders. Since your behavior today clearly proves you are not of sound mind, I am stepping in. I am voting your shares to give Chloe the company." The boardroom erupted. Mr. Henderson slammed his hands flat on the table, standing up so fast his chair rolled backward, hitting the glass wall. "Elias never mentioned a power of attorney to me, Shirley," he shouted, his voice echoing in the large room. "He spent the last 6 months of his life structuring this portfolio specifically to ensure Jada had equal voting rights to prevent a hostile takeover. He would never sign that document. He trusted Jada with his financials, not you, and certainly not Preston." Preston immediately stepped forward, adjusting his silk tie, his smug corporate arrogance returning in an instant. He placed his hand on the blue folder, tapping the thick gold seal on the front page. "The document is fully notarized and legally binding, Mr. Henderson," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It was drafted by my firm and executed flawlessly. If you or this board attempt to block Shirley from voting Jada's shares, I will personally file an injunction that will freeze every single commercial property asset this company holds. I will tie this board up in litigation for the next decade. By the time we are done in court, there will be nothing left of Elias' legacy but massive legal fees and empty bank accounts." I looked at the blue folder resting on the table. Then I looked at Chloe, who had suddenly stopped sobbing. She wiped her eyes, sitting up straighter in our father's leather chair. The terror on her face was gone, replaced by a sickly, triumphant smirk. She knew Shirley would come to her rescue. Shirley always came to her rescue, sweeping in to protect her golden child from the consequences of her own horrific actions. My mind raced backward, replaying the events of the previous evening. Shirley pulling me aside in the kitchen. Shirley digging her manicured fingers into my arm, demanding I take the vodka bottle. Shirley telling me to stop ruining the repast and go home. She did not just look the other way. While Preston and Chloe planned to sedate me, she actively orchestrated it. She was the one who ensured the poisoned bottle ended up in my hands while playing the role of the grieving widow for the church congregation. They did not just want to sideline me for a single meeting. They wanted absolute total control of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, and my own mother was the architect of my destruction. I looked around the room, analyzing the battlefield. Mr. Henderson and the elder board members were furious, but they were also seasoned businessmen. They knew Preston was not bluffing about the litigation. A protracted legal battle would tank the company's stock, halt dividend payouts, and ruin the upcoming quarterly acquisitions. The room was completely paralyzed by Preston's legal threat and Shirley's forged authority. I looked at Shirley. Her chin was raised, a silent challenge, daring me to throw a tantrum and prove her point to the board. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to cry and beg the board to listen to me so she could point her finger and validate her claims about my mental instability. That was the fatal mistake she always made. She thought because I was her daughter, I still craved her approval. She thought I was still that broken teenager desperate for my family to love me. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I reached out and picked up the emergency room toxicology report from the table, carefully folding it and slipping it back into the pocket of my gray hoodie. I looked at the three of them standing united at the head of my father's boardroom. They thought they had won because they held a piece of paper signed by a corrupt lawyer. I realized this conspiracy wasn't just my sister and her husband. My mother orchestrated the entire takeover. I am completely outnumbered in this room, but they forgot they were dealing with a woman who manages wealth for a living and knows exactly how to destroy a bank account. I do not stay in the boardroom to argue with a piece of paper. I turn on my heel and follow Shirley as she marches past the mahogany doors and heads straight down the hall into my father's executive suite. She attempts to click the lock, but I force my weight against the heavy wood. The door shuts behind us, trapping the two of us inside the room where my father built his legacy. The scent of his favorite sandalwood cologne still hangs in the air like a ghost watching this betrayal unfold. Shirley walks over to his massive desk and casually sets her designer tote bag down. She does not look at my blood-stained clothes. She does not ask if the man I am about to marry is breathing on his own. She just reaches up to adjust the pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. I ask her the only question that matters. I ask her how she could hand me a bottle of poison and smile in my face. She rolls her eyes like I am a teenager complaining about a missed curfew. She says it was just a mild sedative. She says Preston promised it would only make me sleep through the weekend, so the board could handle the transition smoothly. She actually has the nerve to blame Terrence. She says nobody told my fiancé to open a bottle of liquor that did not belong to him. I step closer to the desk, my hands shaking with a rage so pure it feels like ice. I tell her that Terrence had to be intubated because his heart almost stopped. I tell her they committed a felony. Shirley slams her hands down on the desk. She tells me to lower my voice and show some respect. She points a manicured finger at me and says, "I have been selfish since the day I packed my bags for college and refused to join the family firm." She throws my success in my face. She says I walked away from my own blood to manage portfolios for athletes and tech executives. You wanted to be independent. Jada. She spits out, her voice dripping with resentment. You wanted to prove you were smarter than all of us. You made your own millions. You already have enough. Then comes the justification that shatters whatever illusion I had left of her maternal instinct. Chloe needs this portfolio, she tells me. She says Preston has drained their accounts trying to keep up appearances at the country club. She says Chloe is drowning in debt, and if she does not secure this executor position, the bank will foreclose on their Buckhead estate. Shirley looks me dead in the eye and says she cannot allow her eldest daughter to be humiliated in front of their entire social circle. I stare at the woman who gave birth to me. The sheer audacity of her logic is suffocating. I ask her if my life was the acceptable price for paying off Chloe's mortgage. Shirley does not even flinch. She points toward the door and tells me the shareholder meeting is over. Go back to the hospital, Jada, she commands. Sit with your fiancé. Leave the family business to the people who actually care about protecting the family name. She turns her back to me and looks out the massive window at the Atlanta skyline, entirely dismissing my existence. She thinks she has won. She thinks because she holds a piece of paper signed by a corrupt lawyer that she holds all the power. She thinks I am going to collapse into tears and run away because my mother does not love me. I look around the office one last time. I see my father's framed first dollar on the wall. I see the empire he built with his own sweat. Then I look at the parasite standing behind his desk. I do not scream. I do not cry. I turn around and walk out of the executive suite. I stride past the boardroom where Preston is already uncorking the champagne and handing a glass to my sister. I take the elevator down to the lobby and walk out into the bright morning sun. But I do not get into my car to drive back to the intensive care unit to weep by Terrence's bedside. I get into my car and drive straight to my own high-rise office in Midtown. I am going to my desk to pull the financial triggers and show them exactly why I am the most ruthless wealth manager in this city. I strode into the gleaming glass lobby of my Midtown wealth management firm with the singular focus of an executioner. My assistant took one look at my blood-stained gray sweatpants and wild uncombed hair, opening her mouth to speak, but my glare shut her down instantly. I bypassed the morning pleasantries, locked myself in my corner office, and booted up my secure trading terminal. My father built his real estate empire, but for the last 7 years, I was the unseen architect, managing the liquidity of those assets. I knew every account number, every routing code, and every banking executive holding his funds. Shirley thought a piece of paper signed by a slick lawyer gave her the keys to the kingdom. She forgot that I am the one who built the vault. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I drafted a formal legal injunction citing an active dispute over the legitimacy of the power of attorney. With my credentials and fiduciary authority on file, I triggered an emergency freeze on the primary operational accounts for my father's holding company. I locked down the escrow accounts holding the deposits for 3 major commercial developments. I froze the payroll distribution line for the executive board. I severed the automated transfers. By the time I hit enter, Not a single dime could move in or out of that empire without my direct authorization. Chloe's mortgage payment would bounce. Preston's massive legal retainer would fail to clear. They wanted to steal the family business, so I starved it of oxygen. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the confirmation screens. I knew it would take less than 30 minutes for Preston to get the automated denial alerts. I expected angry phone calls. I expected a barrage of legal cease and desist emails. I did not expect the double glass doors of my firm to be thrown open by law enforcement. I was staring at my monitor when 4 Atlanta Police Department officers, flanked by 2 plainclothes detectives, marched directly onto the trading floor. The low hum of ringing phones and morning market chatter died instantly. Dozens of my colleagues, junior analysts, and senior partners stopped dead in their tracks, turning their heads as the officers bypassed reception and headed straight for my glass-enclosed office. Preston did not just send an angry email. He weaponized his connections as a high-powered corporate attorney to publicly humiliate me and threaten my financial licenses. The lead detective pushed my door open without knocking. He demanded I step away from my computer, loudly declaring that I was under investigation for corporate espionage and grand larceny. Preston had filed an emergency police report claiming that when I entered my father's executive suite earlier that morning, I had stolen proprietary company documents and trade secrets to illegally manipulate the market. It was a complete fabrication, a brutal and calculated lie designed to strip me of my credibility and trigger an automatic suspension from the Financial Regulatory Board. Preston knew exactly what he was doing. For a black woman in corporate finance, a public arrest is a career death sentence. He wanted the optics of me being dragged out like a common criminal to destroy my reputation before I could even bring the toxicology report to the authorities. They did not ask me to come quietly. They ordered me to turn around and place my hands behind my back, right there in front of the people I managed, the peers I had outperformed, and the executives who trusted me with billions of dollars. Cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around my wrists. My mother and my sister were perfectly fine letting a white lawyer send the police to drag a black woman out of her own office in handcuffs just to secure their stolen inheritance. I kept my head held high as they marched me through the bullpen, refusing to let a single tear fall. I locked eyes with my managing partner, giving him a swift nod to let him know I had this under control, even as the officers shoved me into the back of a squad car. The interrogation room at the downtown precinct smelled of stale coffee and cheap industrial cleaner. They shackled my wrist to a metal bar bolted to the table, leaving me to sit in my blood-stained clothes for 2 agonizing hours. When the detective finally walked in, he dropped a thick file on the table. He leaned in, trying to play the intimidating bad cop, telling me I was facing severe felony charges that would guarantee I never worked in the financial sector again. Then he slid a piece of paper across the metal table. It was a release form. He told me that if I lifted the financial freeze on my father's company accounts, the aggrieved parties were willing to drop the criminal charges. I looked at the paper, then I looked the detective dead in his eyes and laughed. The sound bounced off the concrete walls. Preston was actually arrogant enough to use the police department as his personal collection agency. I leaned forward as far as the handcuffs would allow and told the detective I knew exactly who drafted that release form. I told him he was acting as a highly paid errand boy for a corrupt corporate lawyer attempting to cover up an attempted murder. I told the detective that I handled compliance for federal regulators and that he was holding a document that proved coercion. I promised him that if he did not take these cuffs off me right now, my legal team would own his badge, his pension, and this entire precinct by Friday morning. I demanded my legal counsel and invoked my right to remain silent, daring them to charge me with a crime they had absolutely zero physical evidence to support. They knew they had nothing but Preston's hearsay. After another hour of posturing, a frustrated lieutenant walked in and ordered the detective to uncap my wrists. I was released pending further investigation, their intimidation tactic having failed spectacularly. They handed me my personal belongings in a clear plastic bag. I walked out of the precinct, the heavy glass doors sliding open to the blistering midday Atlanta heat. I stopped at the bottom of the concrete steps, the breath catching in my throat. Standing next to my car, leaning heavily against the driver's side door, was Terrence. I was wearing hospital scrubs and a pale yellow discharge bracelet wrapped around his wrist. The clear medical tape was still stuck to the back of his hand where he had ripped his own intravenous line out. He looked physically drained, his skin ashen from the massive dose of sedatives, but when he lifted his head to look at me, his eyes were burning with adulterated rage. He had discharged himself against medical advice, and he was absolutely ready to go to war. I threw my arms around Terrence right there in the precinct parking lot. His body was tense and shivering slightly from the aftershocks of the massive chemical dose, but his grip on me was ironclad. I told him he should be in a hospital bed. He looked down at me and said he would rest when the people who put him there were buried under a federal indictment. I unlocked the passenger door and helped him inside. I drove us back to our townhouse, breaking every speed limit on the way. The moment we walked through our front door, Terrence did not head for the bedroom. He walked straight into his home office and locked the heavy soundproof door behind us. This room was his domain. It looked like a subterranean command center with 6 curved monitors humming to life, illuminating his face in a cool blue glow. Terrence was a senior cybersecurity analyst who routinely stress-tested firewalls for multinational defense contractors. Preston thought he was a genius because he wore $3,000 suits and shouted legal jargon in boardrooms. Preston had absolutely no idea he had just picked a fight with a man who could dismantle his entire digital existence before lunch. Terrence sank into his ergonomic chair, his fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard with a terrifying speed. He bypassed standard search engines, entirely diving straight into the encrypted backdoors he used for high-level threat hunting. I stood behind him, placing my hands on his shoulders, feeling the residual tremors running through his muscles. He told me to pull up the exact file name Preston had flashed at the shareholder meeting. I gave him the document tracking number I had memorized when Shirley slammed the heavy blue folder onto the mahogany table. Preston was arrogant. He assumed that because his law firm catered to Atlanta's elite, their servers were impenetrable. Terrence cracked their primary firewall in exactly 11 minutes. He did not just find the document. He pulled the raw metadata directly from the law firm's cloud storage. Terrence brought up a split screen showing the clean digital file of the power of attorney on the left and the raw creation footprint on the right. "Look at the creation date," Terrence said, his voice raspy from the breathing tube. I leaned in and read the green text scrolling across the black terminal screen. "My father Elias passed away on a Tuesday." The official digital timestamp on Shirley's power of attorney showed the document was initially drafted, opened, and digitally signed on a Friday. It was created exactly 3 days after my father took his last breath. Preston had forged a legal directive from a dead man, and Shirley had presented it to the board of directors as absolute truth. They were committing massive corporate fraud, and they thought my emotional state would keep me too distracted to verify the paperwork. But Terrence was not finished. He told me that corporate lawyers like Preston do not stick their necks out and risk disbarment just to help their wives win a family feud. Terrence said there is always a secondary motive, and that motive always involves a paper trail. He ran a deeper diagnostic script specifically targeting the encrypted folders attached to Preston's personal billing accounts. Lines of code cascaded down the monitors for several tense minutes until a series of hidden spreadsheets populated the screen. Terrence opened the first ledger and the blood froze in my veins. These were not standard corporate routing numbers. Terrence had uncovered a labyrinth of offshore wire transfers bleeding directly out of my father's primary holding company. Preston had set up 3 dummy shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and was manually transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the operational funds. I am a wealth management advisor. I spend my life analyzing asset allocation. I stared at the screen, recognizing the pattern immediately. The money was not being invested, it was being dumped. Terrence tracked the final destination of the offshore wires. The funds were being funneled directly to high-stakes international gambling syndicates and private casino markers in Macau. I stood frozen behind his chair. Chloe did not have the intelligence to orchestrate an international embezzlement scheme, and Preston was far too greedy to waste stolen money on a casino. There was only one person in my family who took weekly trips to coastal gambling resorts and hosted private high-stakes games in her basement. My mother, Shirley. The entire twisted reality of the past few days crashed down on me. Shirley did not authorize this hostile takeover just to protect Chloe's lifestyle. Shirley had secretly gambled away millions of dollars, plunging herself into a massive, insurmountable debt that was about to bankrupt the entire estate. My father must have found out before he died. That was why he spent his final months restructuring the portfolio to ensure I had equal voting rights. Elias was trying to lock Shirley out of the accounts before she could drain the company dry. Preston discovered the debt and saw his golden opportunity. He promised Shirley he would cover up her massive financial crimes and protect her from federal prison if she helped him seize absolute control of the company. Preston was using the fake power of attorney to quietly siphon the remaining funds to pay off her bookies, ensuring he could legally frame me for the missing millions if the accounts ever went under an official audit. They poisoned Terrence to stop me from attending that meeting because they knew I was the only person with the financial expertise to spot the missing money. I looked at the digital evidence of my own mother stealing from my father's legacy to fund her gambling addiction. I watched the cursor blink on the monitor, holding the definitive proof that Preston forged legal documents to cover up a multi-million-dollar theft. Terrence leaned back in his chair, exhausted but victorious. He looked up at me and asked what we were going to do with this digital arsenal. I told him we were not going to hand this over to the corrupt local detectives Preston had in his pocket. Shirley and Chloe were hosting a lavish memorial gala for my father tonight, to project an image of perfect family unity to the Atlanta elite. I told Terrence to rest and gather his strength because I was going to crash their high society party in a crimson dress and let them know the executioner was coming for them. The grand ballroom of the luxury hotel was drowning in white lilies and absolute hypocrisy. Shirley and Chloe had spared no expense to throw what they billed as a memorial gala for my father Elias. In reality, it was a heavily orchestrated public relations campaign. They needed to project an image of untouchable wealth and perfect family unity to Atlanta's black elite before the official will reading on Friday. The room was crawling with local politicians, real estate developers, and influential pastors. Shirley was terrified that the rumors of my father's company facing a leadership crisis would cause investors to pull their capital. She needed this night to go perfectly to secure her social standing and convince the city that Chloe was the rightful heir. This gala was classic Shirley. Growing up, she would miss my high school debate championships to attend charity balls. She had no actual interest in just to be photographed next to the mayor. She used wealth as a weapon and a shield. Tonight was no different. She was using my father's memory as a networking event to cover up the fact that she had gambled his legacy away at offshore casino tables. To ensure her perfect night went undisturbed, my mother had explicitly banned me from the premises. She went as far as sending my photograph to the private security firm hired for the evening, labeling me as a disgruntled and mentally unstable relative who posed a physical threat to the guests. She genuinely believed a generic security warning would keep me away from the empire my father and I had quietly managed together for years. I pulled my car up to the valet stand and stepped out into the humid Georgia night. I did not wear black. Black was for mourning, and I was entirely done crying over a family that wanted me dead. I wore a floor-length crimson silk gown. It was the color of war. It was a deliberate choice designed to remind them exactly what they had tried to spill to get their hands on those offshore accounts. I walked up the marble steps of the hotel. When the security guards at the entrance moved to block my path, I simply handed the head of security my platinum corporate identification and reminded him that my management firm handled the pension fund for his entire private security company. He looked at my credentials, looked at the crimson dress, and wisely stepped aside. The heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open and I stepped inside. The soft classical music floating from the string quartet in the corner felt instantly out of place. The shift in the room was immediate and electric. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The polite clinking of crystal champagne flutes completely stopped. I walked slowly across the polished floor, letting the train of my red dress glide behind me like a warning flag. I watched heads turn. I saw my father's oldest business associates nudging each other and whispering behind their hands. They knew the tension in my family, but seeing me crash a morning event in bright red was a scandal Atlanta society would talk about for years. I did not break my stride. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and offered a slight acknowledging nod to a group of investors I had personally vetted just last quarter. They nodded back, their eyes wide with poorly concealed shock. They respected power, and they knew walking into a hostile room dressed like a target required a terrifying amount of it. Across the massive room, standing in front of a tacky ice sculpture carved into the shape of my father's corporate logo, was my sister. Chloe was draped in expensive black velvet, playing the role of the tragic, heartbroken daughter. She was laughing softly at a joke told by a banking executive holding her champagne flute with delicate precision. Then her eyes shifted and locked directly onto mine. The transition was instantaneous. Her polite, manufactured smile completely fell off her face. The color drained from her cheeks so fast she looked like she might faint right into the ice sculpture. She froze, staring at my crimson dress, cutting a path straight through the sea of black and gray morning suits. Panic, pure and unadulterated, flashed across her features. She frantically slapped Preston on the arm, dropping all pretense of high society grace. Her husband turned around. Preston's smug white face immediately hardened into a mask of aggressive fury the second he spotted me. He knew my presence here destroyed the narrative they had spent the last 3 days building. He knew that if I opened my mouth in front of these investors, their entire hostile takeover would collapse before the appetizers were served. They did not wait for me to cross the room. Preston grabbed Chloe by the elbow, and they practically sprinted toward me, pushing past a city councilman to cut me off before I could reach the center of the ballroom. I stood perfectly still near a towering floral arrangement waiting for them to arrive. Preston did not bother with pleasantries. He seized my upper arm in a punishing grip, his fingers digging into my skin. He yanked me forward, dragging me roughly through a set of heavy wooden side doors and shoving me into a dimly lit private parlor. Chloe stumbled in right behind us, and Preston slammed the heavy door shut, cutting off the music and the whispers, trapping us together in the suffocating silence. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, sealing us inside the parlor and cutting off the ambient chatter of the ballroom. The room smelled of expensive cigars and old leather, a sharp contrast to the suffocating floral scent of the gala outside. Preston did not waste a single second. He immediately reached into the breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo and pulled out a crisp folded document. He dropped it onto a low mahogany side table and slid it across the polished wood toward me. I glanced down and saw a certified bank check made out to my name. It was for $100,000. "Take the money," Jada Preston said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening hiss. "Take the money and walk out the back doors of this hotel right now. If you stay here and fight us, my firm will tie you up in litigation until you are completely bankrupt. You will spend the next 10 years drowning in legal fees, and I will personally see to it that your wealth management licenses are revoked for corporate sabotage. You are completely out of your league." Before I could respond, the parlor door opened a crack and quickly shut again. Shirley slipped inside, locking the deadbolt behind her. She smoothed the front of her black designer gown, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated contempt as she looked at my crimson dress. She walked over to stand right beside her golden child, forming a physical wall of opposition against me. "You have always been a bitter, jealous spinster," Jada Shirley spat out, her voice venomous in the quiet room. "You are trying to ruin your father's legacy, just because you could never land a proper husband of your own, and now you are lashing out because Chloe has the life you always wanted." She took a step closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You did this exact same thing at her wedding," Shirley continued, twisting history to fit her narrative. "You refused to be her maid of honor because you could not stand to see her shine. Now you are crashing a memorial gala like a common streetwalker, trying to embarrass this family in front of Atlanta's most influential investors. Your fiancé could not handle his liquor and had a medical episode, and you are using it as an excuse to throw a tantrum. Take Preston's generous offer and go back to your empty townhouse before I have security drag you out by your hair." I looked down at the check resting on the table. $100,000. They were trying to buy my silence and my compliance for a fraction of what my mother routinely lost at a single blackjack table in Macau. They actually believed I was desperate enough or intimidated enough to fold. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to defend my relationship with Terrence or correct her twisted version of my past. I simply smiled. It was a slow, cold, calculated smile that caused Chloe to take a physical step backward. You love your legal threats, Preston, I said smoothly, reaching into my clutch purse. You love your aggressive paperwork and your courtroom intimidation tactics. But in my line of work, we do not rely on empty bluffs. We rely on hard digital assets. I pulled my phone out, unlocking the screen with my thumb. I turned the media volume all the way up and pressed play. Chloe's frantic, hyperventilating voice filled the small parlor. The audio was crisp and undeniably clear, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. Jada, how much did he drink? Did you drink any of it? You weren't supposed to share it. I hit pause. The recording stopped, but the echo of her guilt seemed to hang in the air long after the sound faded. The silence in the room became absolute and deafening. Chloe looked like all the blood had been violently siphoned from her body. Her knees visibly buckled, and she reached out to grip the back of a leather armchair just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Preston stared at his wife with a look of pure, unfiltered disgust, realizing just how sloppy and reckless she had been. I thought he had committed the perfect corporate crime, utilizing a forged document and an untraceable poison, but his own wife had handed me a full verbal confession on a silver platter. You see, Chloe, I said casually, dropping the phone back into my purse. When you attempt a hostile takeover, you should really make sure you do not leave a trail of digital breadcrumbs. But when you attempt murder, you should probably make sure you do not leave the murder weapon sitting on my kitchen counter. Chloe opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She gasped for air like a fish thrown onto dry land, her eyes wide with sheer terror. Shirley stood frozen, her hand clutching her pearl necklace, unable to process how quickly her perfect night was unraveling. That recording is already backed up to 3 separate secure cloud servers. I continued, taking a step toward them and letting the reality of their situation crush the last remaining air out of the room. But that is not even the best part. You actually thought I was just sitting in the hospital crying over my fiancé. You thought I was too broken by grief to fight back. You have absolutely no idea what I have been doing for the past 2 days. I looked directly at my mother, watching her pristine facade crack and splinter. The Atlanta Police Department and federal investigators currently have the frosted vodka bottle you shoved into my hands, I announced, my voice ringing with total authority. They have the shattered glass from my kitchen floor containing Terrence's DNA and the residual synthetic muscle relaxant. And they have the official, heavily documented hospital toxicology reports proving exactly what was in your generous peace offering. Preston recovered faster than my mother or sister. The initial shock of the audio recording had barely settled into the heavy air of the parlor before his corporate survival instincts kicked in. He stepped away from Chloe, physically distancing himself from his own wife, leaving her trembling by the armchair. It was a subtle movement, but it told me everything I needed to know about his loyalty. When the ship goes down, Preston will throw anyone overboard to keep his own suit dry. He stepped directly into my personal space. He used his height, towering over me, trying to cast a shadow of intimidation that I simply refused to stand in. His face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. A recording of a hysterical woman proves absolutely nothing about me. Jada, he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous register. You have audio of my wife panicking. That is hearsay. It is circumstantial at best. You have zero proof that I knew what was in that bottle, and you certainly have no proof that I instructed her to give it to you. If the police come knocking, I will simply say, Chloe acted alone out of grief and sibling rivalry. I am a senior partner at one of the most powerful law firms in Atlanta. Do you really think a local detective is going to raid my home over a spurned sister's conspiracy theory? Chloe gasped, finally finding her voice. Preston, you told me to do it, she cried, reaching out to grab his sleeve. You gave me the vial. You said it would just make her sleep. Preston violently yanked his arm out of her grasp without taking his eyes off me. Shut your mouth, Chloe, he snapped, his true vicious nature slicing through his polished exterior. You have done enough damage for one night. Speak another word and I will leave you to face the criminal charges completely on your own. My mother let out a strangled sob, realizing the monster she had welcomed into our family to secure her own social standing was now actively threatening to sacrifice her golden child to save his own skin. Shirley stepped forward, raising a trembling hand to intervene, but Preston shot her a glare so lethal she instantly froze. He turned his full attention back to me, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. You think you are playing a brilliant game here, Jada, he whispered. But you are out of your depth. You might manage other people's money, but I manage the people who make the rules. The probate judge handling your father's estate is a personal friend of mine. We play golf every Sunday at East Lake. I own the judge handling this portfolio. The emergency injunction you filed this morning will be overturned by noon on Monday. Your financial freeze will be nullified. And once Chloe is legally installed as the executor, I will use your father's own corporate funds to sue your wealth management firm into the ground for tortious interference. You have no real play here. You are just a loud, bitter woman holding a piece of useless audio. I stood perfectly still. My heart rate did not spike. My hands did not tremble. I looked directly into his eyes, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. He was banking on the old Atlanta power dynamics. He believed his white privilege, his expensive law degree, and his country club connections made him invincible against a black woman demanding accountability. He thought he was the smartest person in the room because he had manipulated a grieving widow and a greedy sister. I had no idea I already held the routing numbers to his offshore shell accounts in Macau. He had no idea my fiancé had already bypassed his firm's firewall and extracted the metadata, proving he forged the power of attorney document 3 days after my father took his last breath. He thought I was playing checkers while I was holding the pieces to checkmate his entire existence. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not need to shout. You are banking on a local judge saving your life, Preston. I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. You are banking on local jurisdiction. But financial crimes of the magnitude you have committed do not stay local. They cross state lines. They cross international borders. And when they do, your golf buddies at the country club cannot save you. A brief, almost imperceptible flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. He tried to maintain his sneer, but the muscle in his jaw twitched. Take the check, Jada, he demanded, pointing to the piece of paper resting on the mahogany side table. The $100,000 and walk away while you still have a career. I glanced down at the certified bank check. It represented everything they thought I was worth. It represented the cheap price tag they put on my father's legacy, my fiancé's life, and my silence. I looked back up at Preston, tracing the lapels of his custom-tailored black tuxedo. Enjoy the gala, Preston! I said, the words falling like absolute ice. Drink the champagne, shake hands with the investors, smile for the photographers. Soak in every single second of this lavish party you threw with my father's stolen money. Because I promise you this is the very last time you will ever wear that tuxedo. I turned away from him, my crimson silk dress sweeping across the floor. I did not spare a single glance for Chloe, who was sobbing into her hands, or my mother, who was staring at the wall in catatonic shock. I walked over to the heavy wooden parlor doors, leaving the $100,000 check sitting entirely untouched on the side table. I opened the door, letting the sound of the string quartet and the clinking of crystal glasses rush back into the private room. I stepped out into the bright lights of the ballroom, pulling the door firmly shut behind me. I left them locked inside that dark, suffocating parlor. I left them paranoid, sweating, and absolutely terrified, wondering exactly what I knew, who I was talking to, and what devastating move I was going to make next. I grabbed a fresh glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, took a slow, victorious sip, and walked out the front doors of the hotel into the warm Atlanta night, ready to set the final trap. The warm, Atlanta night air hit my face as I walked out of the luxury hotel, leaving my mother's sister and brother-in-law locked inside that private parlor. I did not look back. I got into my car and drove home to Terrence. The time for throwing punches in the dark was over. If I wanted to completely dismantle Preston and Shirley, I had to make them believe they had already won. I had to feed their arrogance until they choked on it. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee, staring at my phone. Terrence was asleep upstairs, his body still recovering from the massive chemical shock of the poison. I opened my message thread with my mother. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For my entire life, Shirley wanted me to bow down. She wanted me to be the broken, obedient daughter who accepted her scraps and stepped aside for Chloe. Playing the victim went against every single instinct I had built as a wealth management advisor, but giving her exactly what she wanted was the only way to blind her. Mother, I am exhausted. That is what I typed into my phone. I hit the spacebar and continued crafting the lie. Terrence is still very weak from the hospital. I cannot fight this battle anymore. I do not want to tear my father's legacy apart in a courtroom. Have Preston prepare the settlement papers. I will attend the official reading on Friday to sign away my shares and relinquish my voting rights. I just want peace. I hit send. I set the phone face down on the granite counter and waited. It took less than 5 minutes for her to reply. The notification lit up my screen with a message dripping in fake maternal relief. Oh, Jada, I am so glad you have finally come to your senses. Family is about forgiveness and recognizing your own limitations. Your father would be so proud of you for stepping aside and letting Preston handle the heavy lifting. We will see you on Friday morning, darling. I read the text and felt a cold knot of disgust tighten in my stomach. She did not ask how Terrence was doing. She did not apologize for the poisoned vodka. She only cared that my shares were officially surrendered. An hour later, my professional inbox chimed. It was an email from Preston's legacy law firm. His legal assistant had sent over a heavily worded non-disclosure agreement and a formal letter of resignation for my board seat. Preston was moving with absolute greedy desperation. He assumed my silence meant I was terrified of his country club connections and his threat to ruin my financial licenses. He thought his white privilege and his expensive tailored suits made him untouchable. Hi and Chloe took the bait completely. They thought the war was over. They had absolutely no idea it was just beginning. While they were busy picking out their outfits for the will reading, I was moving with lethal precision. I took the encrypted flash drive Terrence had compiled the night before and placed it securely inside my briefcase. I did not drive to the local Atlanta police precinct. Preston had already proven he had influence with the local detectives when he sent them to my office to humiliate me in handcuffs. I knew local authorities would drag their feet or quietly leak the investigation to his powerful law firm. Financial crimes of this magnitude required a much heavier hammer. As a senior advisor, managing billions in corporate assets, I routinely interfaced with federal regulators. I did not need to walk into a public lobby and wait in line. I made a direct phone call to Director Rollins, a high-level contact I had worked with during a massive corporate audit 2 years ago. I told her I had physical evidence of international wire fraud embezzlement and a forged legal document attempting to seize control of a commercial real estate empire. She told me to come to the federal building immediately. I bypassed the main security checkpoints and was escorted straight into a secure conference room on the top floor of the federal building. Director Rollins was waiting for me alongside Special Agent Carter from the White Collar Crimes Division of the FBI and a senior investigator from the IRS. They were serious, sharp-eyed professionals who did not care about Preston's country club memberships or his golf buddies. I sat down at the metal table and plugged Terrence's encrypted drive into their secure terminal. I did not give them a sob story about my family dynamics. I gave them a forensic financial roadmap to a felony. I pulled up the metadata Terrence had extracted directly from Preston's law firm servers. I showed the federal agents the exact digital timestamp, proving Preston drafted and signed the power of attorney document 3 days after my father took his last breath. Agent Carter leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he verified the digital footprint. Forging a legal document to seize corporate assets was a severe federal offense, but I was not finished. I opened the next folder displaying the labyrinth of offshore routing numbers. I walked the IRS investigator through the shell companies Preston had established in the Cayman Islands. I traced the massive wire transfers bleeding out of my father's operational accounts and funneling directly into international gambling syndicates in Macau. I handed them the proof of Shirley's devastating gambling debts. I explained that Preston was using his status as a corporate attorney to cover up my mother's financial crimes while simultaneously stealing the company out from under me. I then handed Agent Carter a copy of the hospital toxicology report detailing the synthetic muscle relaxant Chloe had given me. I explained that local police were compromised and asked the FBI to take jurisdiction over the poisoning as an overt act of violence in furtherance of a massive federal conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The room went completely silent as the agents stared at the screens. The sheer volume of organized financial crime was staggering. Preston had utilized his firm's secure servers to commit multiple felonies crossing international borders. The federal agents were practically salivating at the paper trail. This was not a messy family dispute. This was a slam-dunk federal racketeering and embezzlement case wrapped in a neat digital bow. Agent Carter looked at me and asked when Preston planned to officially execute the forged document. I told him the official will reading was scheduled for this Friday at 9 in the morning, inside Preston's own law firm. Agent Carter smiled a sharp, dangerous smile. He told me that arresting Preston at his home would give him time to call his powerful friends and spin the narrative. But catching a corporate lawyer in the exact moment he attempts to execute a forged document to steal a multi-million-dollar estate on his own firm's property leaves absolutely zero room for a legal defense. The agents agreed to coordinate a massive multi-agency strike. They would bring the FBI, the IRS, and federal marshals. We timed it perfectly. We were going to let Preston, Chloe, and Shirley sit at that mahogany table and taste their absolute victory right before we kicked the doors off the hinges. The sun had barely set on Thursday evening when the security chime of my townhouse echoed through the hallway. Terrence was upstairs resting in the master bedroom, his strength slowly returning after the nightmare my family had put him through. I was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing the final asset forfeiture documents the federal agents had securely transmitted to my laptop. I glanced at the glowing security monitor mounted on the wall. Standing on my front porch, illuminated by the harsh glare of the security light, was my mother. Shirley was wearing a casual but impeccably tailored cashmere cardigan and holding a foil-covered sweet potato pie. She looked exactly like the caring Southern matriarch she spent decades pretending to be for her church congregation. I locked my laptop screen, walked down the hallway, and opened the heavy front door. I did not unlock the storm door. I just stood there looking at her through the reinforced glass. "Jada, baby, open the door!" Shirley said, her voice dripping with that manufactured honey sweetness she only used when she needed a favor. "I brought you something. I know the last few days have been incredibly stressful for everyone, and I just wanted to check on you and Terrence. We need to talk before tomorrow morning." I unlatched the storm door and pushed it open, but I did not step aside to let her into my home. I stood squarely in the threshold, blocking her path. The humid Atlanta air rushed in, carrying the scent of her expensive floral perfume. It was the same perfume she wore the day she told me my acceptance to a top-tier financial program was a waste of money because no one would trust a black woman from the South Side with their investment portfolios. "What do you want, Mother?" I asked, my voice perfectly flat. Shirley sighed, allowing her shoulders to slump just enough to project maternal exhaustion. She held out the pie. "I just want peace, Jada. I received your text message yesterday, and I cannot tell you how relieved I was. You are making the right choice by stepping down and letting Preston handle the estate. Your father left behind a very complicated portfolio, and you have your own career to worry about. I came to thank you for finally putting the family first. I just want to make sure we are entirely on the same page before we walk into the law firm tomorrow." I looked at the pie in her hands, and then looked directly into her eyes. "Are you checking on my compliance, or are you here to make sure I do not ask any inconvenient questions about where my father's operational funds have been disappearing to?" Shirley flinched. The warm, motherly mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. She quickly composed herself, taking a half-step closer. "You are too smart for your own good, Jada," she murmured, glancing nervously over her shoulder toward the quiet street. "That has always been your problem. You look at everything like a balance sheet. Yes, Preston and I had to make some rapid financial adjustments after your father died. I made a few minor mistakes, just some bad investments at the coastal resorts. I got a little behind, and Preston offered a perfectly legal solution to consolidate the debt using the company accounts. If you make a scene at the lawyer's office tomorrow and demand an audit, you will ruin me. The bank will foreclose on my house. The church board will strip my title. You would be throwing your own mother to the wolves over a simple financial misunderstanding." A simple financial misunderstanding. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. She was standing on my porch, holding a baked good, trying to casually brush off millions of dollars in offshore gambling debts and international wire fraud as a minor accounting error. "You poisoned my fiancé," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "You handed me a bottle laced with a synthetic paralytic, Terrence almost died on this exact hardwood floor you are trying to step onto. Shirley waved her free hand in the air, a gesture of pure absolute dismissal. Oh, please, Jada, she scoffed, dropping the sweet southern act completely. You are blowing that entirely out of proportion. Chloe is high-strung, and she made a foolish, impulsive decision because she was terrified you would steal the company from her. It was just a sedative. It was a misunderstanding, and Terrence is perfectly fine now. You are holding on to a grudge just to punish us because you have always resented your sister. You always hated that I protected her. She needed me, Jada. You never needed anyone. You were always so hard and calculating. I had to secure Chloe's future, and I had to protect my own home. The sheer audacity of her justification took the oxygen out of the air. For 32 years she demanded I shrink myself so Chloe could shine. She demanded I ignore my own ambition to cater to her fragile ego. And now, having been caught stealing from my father's grave and orchestrating a physical attack on my household, she was standing on my porch, demanding I sacrifice my inheritance and my sanity to save her from the consequences of her own gambling addiction. She wanted me to walk into that law firm tomorrow and quietly sign my birthright over to a corrupt white lawyer, just so she could keep her country club membership and her pristine public image. Shirley pushed the pie toward my chest, a forced, strained smile returning to her face. Just sign the settlement papers tomorrow, Jada. Do not ask questions. Do not challenge Preston. Let Chloe be the executor, and I promise I will make sure Preston compensates you for your trouble once the accounts are stabilized. Please just promise me you will not make a scene at the reading. I looked at the pie wrapped in silver foil. Then I looked into the desperate, greedy eyes of the woman who enabled my abuse my entire life. I did not yell. I did not slam the door in her face. I did something much more terrifying. I gave her the exact reassurance she came here for. I reached out and gently pushed the pie back toward her chest, refusing to take it. I looked her dead in the eye, my expression completely void of any daughterly affection or fear. Do not worry, Mother, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. You do not need to bribe me with pastries or empty promises. I know exactly what I need to do tomorrow morning. I am going to walk into that conference room, and I am going to give you exactly what you deserve. Shirley let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief. Her shoulders visibly relaxed, and a genuine smug smile spread across her face. She thought she had won. She believed her maternal guilt trip had successfully broken my spirit. She believed I was conceding defeat to save the family name. Thank you, Jada, she said, adjusting her cardigan and turning back toward the driveway. I knew you would finally do the right thing. I will see you tomorrow at 9. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk back to her luxury sedan. I watched her drive away, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just secured her own destruction. I closed the heavy front door, sliding the deadbolt securely into place. I walked back to my kitchen island, opened my laptop, and reviewed the final strike coordinates with the federal agents. She thought I was bringing a pen to a contract signing. She had absolutely no idea I was bringing the entire federal government to a crime scene. Friday morning arrived with a crisp edge to the Atlanta air. I was awake long before the sun came up, sitting in my home office and drinking a cup of black coffee. My phone buzzed on the glass desk. It was an automated notification from a burner social media account I used to monitor my sister. I opened the application, and there was Chloe broadcasting her absolute delusion to the entire world. She had just posted a picture on her story, holding a crystal flute of orange juice and champagne. She was sitting in the back of a luxury town car wearing a stark white designer pantsuit. The caption slapped across the bottom of the image read, "Securing generational wealth today, and stepping into my father's legacy." She had tagged Preston's downtown law firm and added a sparkling crown emoji. She was literally celebrating her hostile takeover on the internet for all of her country club friends to see. She thought my cryptic promise to my mother last night meant I was surrendering. She genuinely believed that by 9 o'clock this morning, I would sit quietly across a mahogany table and sign away my birthright so she could pay off her mortgage and keep her husband happy. I stared at the photo of her smug, smiling face. It was the face of a woman who had never been told no her entire life. It was the face of someone who believed she could poison her own family and walk away completely unscathed. I locked my phone screen and slid it into my briefcase. She wanted to broadcast her victory to the public. I was going to make sure her downfall was spectacular enough to match. I walked into the master bedroom. Terence was already awake and dressed. He was moving a little slower than usual, his body still fighting off the residual fatigue from the massive dose of synthetic muscle relaxant, but his posture was rigid and unyielding. He wore a charcoal gray suit that perfectly matched the severity of the morning. I stepped in front of the full-length mirror and slipped my arms into a tailored deep emerald green blazer. It was a sharp, structured piece that commanded attention. It was not morning attire, it was armor. Terence stepped up behind me. He reached out with his large, warm hands and smoothly pulled the zipper up the back of my matching dress beneath the blazer. He rested his hands on my shoulders, meeting my eyes in the mirror. He did not ask if I was ready. He did not ask if I was having second thoughts about sending my own mother and sister to federal prison. He simply kissed the side of my neck and told me it was time to finish this. I picked up the thick red wax-sealed folder from my nightstand. It contained the real, irrevocable trust documents. My father had secretly drafted and filed out of state 6 months before his heart gave out. It was the ultimate trump card. I placed it carefully inside my leather briefcase, right next to the encrypted flash drive, holding every single piece of digital evidence Terence had extracted from Preston's servers. We walked out of our townhouse and got into my car without saying another word. The silence between us was not empty. It was loaded with the heavy electric anticipation of a storm about to break. The drive to downtown Atlanta was a blur of morning commuter traffic and towering glass skyscrapers reflecting the early sun. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the monolithic glass building that housed Preston's legacy law firm. It was an intimidating structure designed to make clients feel small and vulnerable the moment they walked through the revolving doors. But I was not a client and I was not intimidated. I parked my car and sent a single text message to Director Rollins at the Federal Bureau. "We are in the building." Her reply came through exactly 10 seconds later. "We have the perimeter secured. Proceed to the conference room. Wait for the execution phase." I looked at Terence. He gave me a sharp, definitive nod. We stepped out of the car and walked toward the private executive elevators. The polished marble floors of the lobby echoed with the sound of my heels. I knew exactly what was waiting for me on the 45th floor. Shirley would be sitting there in her pearls playing the grieving but resilient matriarch. Preston would be organizing his forged documents with a smug, confident grin, ready to play the brilliant legal savior. And Chloe would be sitting in my father's chair, waiting for me to hand over the keys to the empire she did nothing to build. They thought they had manipulated me into a corner. They thought my love for my fiancé and my exhaustion from their endless toxicity had finally broken my spirit. As the elevator doors slid open, revealing the plush reception area of the law firm, my pulse remained perfectly steady. Chloe was waiting inside that boardroom, fully believing she was walking into a coronation. She had absolutely no idea that the room she was sitting in was about to become an active federal crime scene. The receptionist on the 45th floor directed us to the main executive boardroom. When Terence and I walked through the heavy glass doors, the air inside the room was practically vibrating with greed. The conference room was a sprawling monument to corporate intimidation, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the downtown Atlanta skyline. It was designed to make opposing counsel feel small, but I was not looking at the view. I was looking at the 3 people sitting across the massive mahogany table. My mother Shirley was seated perfectly in the center. She wore a tailored black suit with her signature pearls, looking every inch the respectable grieving widow. She gave me a tight, patronizing smile as I sat down, clearly believing her sweet potato pie routine from the night before had successfully broken my spirit. Next to her sat Chloe, radiating an obnoxious level of arrogance in the stark white designer pantsuit she had been flaunting on the internet all morning. Chloe was literally bouncing her leg under the table, unable to contain her excitement at the prospect of finally securing the wealth she never worked a day in her life for. And at the head of the table where my father Elias used to sit was Preston. He leaned back in his leather executive chair, looking like a king waiting to be crowned. Sitting adjacent to them was the senior estate attorney handling the portfolio transition. He was an older man named Sterling, who had worked closely with Preston's firm for years. Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his gold wire-rimmed reading glasses as he opened a thick leather-bound binder. He did not look at me with any real respect. He looked at me the way a man looks at a minor administrative hurdle that needs to be cleared before he can go to lunch. Sterling began to read the documents aloud. His voice droned on, filling the quiet room with dense legal jargon about fiduciary duties and asset transition. He officially stated that due to my father passing, the company required an immediate appointment of an interim executor to prevent financial destabilization in the commercial real estate markets. He then read the core of their entire fraudulent scheme. He announced that Shirley, holding the primary power of attorney over my father's estate, had elected to vote on behalf of the deceased and use her proxy to elevate Chloe to the position of sole executor. I sat perfectly still, keeping my hands folded on the table. Terrence sat beside me, a silent, towering presence. He was still pale from the poison ravaging his system just days ago, but his jaw was clenched tight, his eyes tracking every single movement Preston made. I watched my mother nod solemnly as Sterling read her forged authority into the official record. This was the same woman who used to scold me for bringing my financial textbooks to the dinner table, telling me that Black women should focus on finding a good provider instead of worrying about interest rates and asset allocation. Now she was weaponizing the very corporate structure she once mocked me for studying, just to funnel millions of dollars to offshore casinos to cover her gambling addiction. I watched Chloe reach out and squeeze Preston's hand. They were seconds away from unlocking the corporate bank accounts. They could already taste the money. Sterling flipped to the final page of his binder. He pulled out a separate document and slid it across the polished mahogany table toward me. Sitting right on top of the legal contract was a certified bank check for $100,000. It was the exact same buyout offer Preston had tried to force on me at the memorial gala. Miss Jada, Sterling said, his tone entirely transactional. Per the agreement reached between the estate and the legal representatives, we just need your signature on the relinquishment of shares. This document legally binds you to the severance package and officially recognizes Chloe's appointment. By signing this, you forfeit any future claims to voting rights within your father's commercial real estate portfolio. Please sign on the dotted line so we can conclude this matter and allow your family to begin the healing process. He extended a heavy silver fountain pen toward me. Chloe let out a small, breathless sigh of anticipation. Shirley leaned forward, offering me a sickeningly sweet nod of encouragement. They were all waiting for me to bow my head, admit defeat, and sign my name. I did not take the pen. I did not look at the check. I raised my right hand, keeping my posture completely rigid in my emerald green blazer, and locked my eyes directly on the estate attorney. I object to these proceedings, I stated, my voice cutting through the silent room like a blade. I contest the validity of the power of attorney, and I completely refuse to sign away my shares. The polite facade in the room shattered instantly. Preston threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming sound of pure, unadulterated condescension, heavily laced with his white corporate privilege. He shook his head and looked at Sterling, rolling his eyes dramatically. Please forgive my sister-in-law, Preston said, waving his hand in my direction, as if I were a petulant child. She has been incredibly emotional since Elias died. She is prone to these kinds of dramatic outbursts when she feels she is not the center of attention. Ignore her theatrics, Sterling. She is just stalling because she is bitter. Shirley immediately chimed in, adopting her best concerned mother voice. Jada, please do not do this right now. We talked about this last night at your house. You promised you were going to be reasonable today. You promised you were going to stop tearing this family apart. Just sign the paper, baby. Let Preston handle the business. You already have a successful career managing other people's money. You do not need your father's legacy, too. They were actively trying to talk over me, attempting to drown out my legal objection by painting me as a hysterical, grieving woman who could not regulate her own emotions. Preston leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, glaring at me with absolute malice. The fake polite smile vanished entirely. Sign the document. Jada. Preston ordered, his voice dropping its friendly tone and turning into a direct, aggressive command. You have absolutely zero leverage here. You are sitting in my firm. You are completely outmatched. Sign the paper right now, or I will have security escort you to the street without a single dime, and I will personally tie your wealth management licenses up in so much litigation you will never work in this city again. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. I did not scream about the poisoned vodka or the forged timestamps. I simply reached down into my leather briefcase resting at my feet. I pulled out the thick, heavy folder I had retrieved from my home safe earlier that morning. It was not a standard corporate binder. It was bound in dark red parchment and sealed with a heavy stamp of deep crimson wax. I placed it on the polished mahogany table directly in front of me. I looked Preston dead in his arrogant eyes, and without saying a single word, I slid the thick red wax-sealed folder straight across the table. It glided over the smooth wood with a soft hiss and stopped directly in front of the estate attorney. Sterling took the heavy silver letter opener resting on his desk and slid it under the thick crimson wax seal. The sharp crack of the hardened wax breaking echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly silent boardroom. He opened the dark red parchment cover and adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses. I watched the exact moment his entire professional reality collapsed. The color drained from his weathered face. His hands began to tremble violently, making the thick legal paper rustle. He flipped to the second page and then the third, his eyes darting frantically across the heavy legal text. He swallowed hard, the sound completely audible across the tense space. Preston slammed his hand onto the armrest of his leather chair. "Read the document, Sterling," he commanded, his voice dripping with mounting irritation. "It is just some desperate forgery she printed out this morning to stall the inevitable. Tell security to get up here." Sterling did not look at Preston. He looked directly at my mother, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute betrayal. "Shirley, this is a Delaware irrevocable living trust," he said, his voice shaking so badly he could barely project it across the table. "It is fully executed, notarized, and recognized across state lines. It transfers every single commercial real estate asset, every liquid operational account, and the entirety of the corporate holding company into a blind trust." Chloe let out a sharp, confused gasp, looking frantically between her husband and the attorney. "What does that mean, Preston? What is he saying?" "It means," Preston hissed, his slick facade finally shattering into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic, "that Elias no longer owned the company when he died." "Exactly," I said, keeping my voice perfectly smooth and dangerously conversational. "My father owned absolutely nothing on the day his heart gave out. 6 months ago, he quietly, legally, and permanently transferred the entirety of his life work into an out-of-state trust. And he named me as the sole unilateral trustee. Your forged power of attorney is completely and utterly useless, Shirley. You cannot claim executive control over corporate assets that a dead man did not even possess." The boardroom descended into absolute pandemonium. "That is a lie!" Chloe screamed, jumping out of her executive chair so fast it rolled backward and hit the floor-to-ceiling window. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me, her chest heaving as she completely lost her mind. "She is lying, Preston. She fabricated that whole folder. Dad would never do that. He would never leave me with nothing. Tell the lawyer it is a fake." "I did not fabricate a single syllable, Chloe," I said calmly. "My father was a proud black man who loved his family, but he was not a fool. He knew exactly what was happening inside his own house. He knew Shirley was taking weekly trips to the coast and draining his personal accounts to fund high-stakes private casino games. He knew she was drowning in a massive, insurmountable ocean of gambling debts." Shirley shot up from her chair, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. "Shut your mouth, Jada!" she shrieked, dropping the respectable grieving widow act entirely. "Elias loved me. He would never lock me out of my own financial security. You are an ungrateful, jealous child, making up disgusting rumors to ruin my good name in this city. Sterling, throw this bitter woman out of your office right now and execute my documents." Sterling shrank back into his chair, holding the red folder up like a shield. "I cannot do that, Shirley," he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The trust is ironclad. It supersedes your power of attorney entirely. She has total legal control." My father also knew I continued ignoring my mother's hysterical demands that Preston was setting up dummy shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. He knew you were planning to use his hard-earned legacy to quietly siphon off funds and pay off Shirley's bookies before the estate went under a federal audit. You thought he was just a clueless old man you could steal from. But he spent his last 6 months alive working with me to build a financial fortress around his empire, ensuring that not a single dime would ever fall into your greedy hands. Preston was staring at the red folder, his breathing ragged. The legal reality of his situation was crashing down on him with the force of a freight train. As a senior corporate defense attorney, he knew exactly what an irrevocable trust meant. But more importantly, he knew what it meant for the document he brought to this meeting. If my father had transferred all his assets 6 months ago, then the power of attorney Preston had drafted and signed 3 days after my father died was not just a useless piece of paper. It was undeniable physical proof of premeditated fraud. He had used his law firm's servers to forge a federal instrument. Preston lost his mind. The polished, arrogant white lawyer who believed he owned the city of Atlanta turned into a desperate, cornered animal. He let out a feral roar and lunged directly across the wide mahogany table, kicking over crystal water glasses and scrambling to grab the red folder from Sterling's trembling hands. He wanted to shred the documents. He wanted to destroy the evidence that was about to cost him his legal license, his freedom, and his lavish lifestyle. He never even made it to the center of the table. Terrence moved with a speed and ferocity that defied the medical trauma his body had endured just days ago. He stood up, grabbing Preston by the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, and violently shoved him backward. Preston flew across the room, crashing hard into the heavy wooden credenza and knocking the silver champagne bucket clattering to the floor. Terrence stood between the table and Preston, a towering, immovable wall of absolute protective rage. "Do not ever reach across a table at my future wife again," Terrence warned, his voice a low, lethal rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Chloe was sobbing hysterically now, dropping to her knees beside Preston and grabbing his arm. Preston was gasping for air, scrambling to push himself up against the wood paneling, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. He was calculating his escape route. He realized his corporate connections could not save him from a room where he had no power. Shirley was hyperventilating, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked ready to snap. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. She finally understood that the daughter she spent 32 years calling a disappointment had just systematically dismantled her entire life in less than 5 minutes. "You cannot do this to us," Jada Shirley pleaded, her voice cracking as she resorted to her final pathetic weapon, playing the victim. "We are your family. You cannot just leave us with nothing. Chloe will lose her house. Preston will lose his career. I will lose everything I have built in this city. You are destroying your own blood." I looked down at the woman who smiled in my face while handing me a bottle of synthetic poison meant to put me in the ground. "I did not destroy you, Mother," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "You destroyed yourselves the moment you decided my life was an acceptable price to pay for your gambling debts. You thought you brought a fake document to a petty family dispute. You brought a forged legal instrument to a federal trap." I raised my right hand into the air and snapped my fingers. The sharp sound cracked through this boardroom, slicing through Chloe's sobbing and Preston's frantic breathing. The heavy double doors of the conference room were kicked open from the outside. They slammed against the glass walls with a deafening crash. 2 armed FBI agents wearing tactical vests stepped into the room, followed immediately by a senior IRS investigator and a team of local Atlanta detectives. They fanned out instantly, securing all the exits and completely locking down the room. Standing on the other side of that boardroom door, I realized the hardest truth a daughter can ever learn. Blood does not make a family. Blood is just a biological coincidence. We are raised in our culture to believe that you protect your relatives at all costs, that you sweep the abuse, the jealousy, and the toxicity under the rug to maintain the image of a perfect household. I spent 32 years shrinking myself so my mother could shine her spotlight on my sister. I thought my relentless hard work would eventually earn their respect, but I learned that toxic people do not respect your hard work. They only resent you for exposing their failures. When you stop playing the role of the obedient victim, the people who benefited from your silence will always call you the villain. Let them. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. Walking away from the people who share your last name is terrifying, but staying to be their punching bag is a death sentence. I had to let go of the mother and sister I wished I had in order to survive the ones I actually got. True security does not come from a family inheritance or a pristine public reputation. It comes from trusting your own intuition, building your own financial independence, and surrounding yourself with people who actually show up for you when the room goes dark. I did not just survive their betrayal. I used the bricks they threw at me to build an empire they can never touch. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and build your own legacy? Share your story in the comments below and hit the subscribe button to join a community of women breaking generational curses and taking back their power.